To the Don, Sophia was simply scenery, a silent shadow in a starched uniform expected to pour wine rather than spill blood. Seeing only her lace apron and lowered eyes, the familiar assumed she was fragile, completely missing the calluses on her trigger finger, hidden beneath white cotton gloves. But when the ambush tore through the Peace Summit in the ruins of the old Sicilian vineyard, and the most feared men in Rome were left bleeding in the dust, the maid didn't scream. Instead, she picked up a fallen guard's sniper rifle and proved that the distance between servitude and sovereignty is often just a matter of survival. The heat rising from the sun-bleached stones was suffocating, shimmering in waves that blurred the horizon. The air reeked of expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and the sharp metallic scent of coming violence. Massimo De Luca stood at the center of the ancient courtyard, flanked by men in €1,000 suits whose bulging shoulder holsters betrayed the lie of this peaceful negotiation. Across from them, the Vesperi family waited with predatory stillness, their fingers drumming against leather-wrapped grips, and behind them all, barely visible against a crumbling marble column, Sophia Rossi held a silver tray of espresso cups with hands that never trembled, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep them still. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy stories like this. The ruins had been chosen for their symbolism, neutral ground where empires had risen and fallen long before the Cosa Nostra carved its name into Sicily's bones. Crumbling arches framed the cloudless sky, and wild rosemary grew through cracks in the marble floor where Roman senators once walked. Now it hosted a different kind of senate, one where votes were counted in bullets and legislation was written in blood. Sophia moved through the gathering like a ghost, the silver tray balanced perfectly in her gloved hands. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a skill, and servitude its most effective disguise. The men didn't see her refilling their glasses or adjusting the small table of refreshments beneath a precarious stone arch. They saw furniture, wallpaper. The inevitable backdrop to their theater of power, Massimo, stood with his back to a section of ancient colonnade, his tailored suit immaculate despite the dust that coated everything else. He exuded the kind of confidence that came from never having lost, his gestures broad and dismissive as he negotiated territory lines with the Vesperi Don. Around him, his security detail maintained their positions with the rigid discipline of men who knew their boss's life depended on their competence. 6 of Rome's finest killers, each carrying enough firepower to start a small war. Across the courtyard, the Vesperi family mirrored the formation. Their Don, a skeletal man named Carmine, whose smile never reached his eyes, nodded along to Massimo's terms with a patience that felt rehearsed. Behind him, his men shifted their weight from foot to foot, hands drifting toward jacket pockets before catching themselves. Sophia noticed. She always noticed. She poured wine for one of Massimo's captains, a bull-necked enforcer named Tony, who didn't acknowledge her presence even as she leaned past his shoulder. From this angle, she could see the Vesperi lieutenant on the far side, checking his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. His jaw was tight, muscles clenched. The youngest one, barely 20 with acne scars on his neck, kept licking his lips and glancing towards the western ridge. Amateur tells, the kind of nervous energy that preceded violence. Sophia retreated to her position by the refreshment table, her face a mask of demure attentiveness. None of the men looked at her. Massimo was in the middle of a story about a shipping container full of counterfeit designer handbags, his voice carrying across the ruins with the casual authority of someone who'd never been interrupted in his life. His audience laughed on cue, and even Carmine Vesperi offered a thin smile. But Sophia wasn't listening to the words. She was reading the room the way she'd been trained to read battlefields, looking for the pattern breaks, the inconsistencies, the moment before chaos announced itself. The sun had shifted lower, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. A warm breeze carried the scent of Mediterranean sage and something else, something chemical and out of place. Sophia's eyes drifted past the gathered men toward the hills that ringed the ruins on three sides. Brown and gold and studded with scrub brush, they provided natural elevation for anyone who understood the geometry of ambush. That's when she saw it. A glint of reflected light from the northern ridge just below the tree line. Barely a flash, there and gone, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever looked through a scope. She froze, the wine bottle suddenly heavy in her hand. Her gaze swept the hillside, cataloguing positions. Another flash, eastern ridge, then a third, closer, perhaps 200 meters out. Crossfire positions, overlapping fields of fire. The ruins were a kill box. Her heart rate didn't spike. That instinct had been trained out of her years ago. But her mind began calculating angles, cover positions, escape routes. The marble column to her left would stop rifle rounds. The collapsed archway provided concealment, but not protection. The courtyard's only exit was a narrow passage that funneled directly into the eastern firing line. She looked at Massimo, who was now shaking Carmine's hand. The deal apparently concluded. His security detail had relaxed fractionally, shoulders dropping, fingers moving away from weapons. They hadn't seen what she'd seen. They were too busy watching the men in front of them to notice the men in the hills. Sophia opened her mouth, then closed it. A maid interrupting a Mafia Don during negotiations would be dismissed at best, struck at worst. Her word meant nothing here. She was part of the furniture, and furniture didn't speak. So she set down the wine bottle with careful precision, positioned herself next to the sturdiest piece of cover in the courtyard, and waited for the world to catch fire. The first shot arrived without preamble, a crack that split the afternoon silence like a whip against stone. Massimo's head of security, a veteran named Costa who'd survived 3 family wars, dropped mid-sentence with a hole where his throat used to be. He hit the marble floor in a spray of red, his expression frozen in permanent surprise. Then for one crystalline moment, the world stopped. The men stared at Costa's body as if waiting for an explanation, their minds unable to reconcile the violence with the context of concluded negotiations. Then the hillsides opened up, and the ancient ruins transformed into an abattoir. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, the staccato rhythm of automatic weapons overlapping into a continuous roar. Massimo's security detail scattered, reaching for weapons they'd never have time to draw. Tony, the bull-necked enforcer, managed to clear his pistol from its holster before rounds stitched across his chest, punching through Italian wool and Kevlar with equal indifference. He spun, fired twice into empty air, then collapsed against a column that had stood for 2,000 years, while another guard made it 3 steps toward cover before his legs disappeared from under him in a mist of red. He crawled for a moment, leaving a dark smear across ancient stone, then stopped moving. The Vespri men weren't running. They were already in position, weapons appearing from jacket pockets and waistbands with practiced efficiency. Carmine himself had vanished behind a section of wall, his skeletal frame surprisingly nimble for a man in his 60s. His lieutenant was screaming coordinates into a radio, directing the fire from the hills. It wasn't a peace summit. It had never been a peace summit. Massimo stood frozen in the center of the kill zone, his expensive suit splattered with Costa's blood, his face a mask of incomprehension. Rounds sparked off the marble around him, chipping away at emperors' faces carved into ancient friezes. One of his remaining guards grabbed his arm, trying to drag him toward the collapsed archway, but the man's head snapped back before they'd gone 2 steps. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, and Massimo stumbled over the body. The Don of Rome, the king of the 7 hills, the man who'd built an empire on calculated violence and strategic cruelty, began to hyperventilate. His hands shook, his knees buckled. He looked around wildly for someone to fix this, to restore order, to make sense of the senseless. But his men were dying. 3 down, 4. The 5th was returning fire toward the eastern ridge, his pistol laughably inadequate against the range and firepower arrayed against them. A burst of automatic fire ended his defiance, and he collapsed across the refreshment table Sophia had carefully arranged 20 minutes earlier. Through it all, Sophia hadn't moved. She stood beside her chosen marble column as rounds whipped past, her white apron stark against the shadows, her expression unchanged. While Massimo gasped for air and his empire crumbled around him, the maid watched the battlefield with the detached focus of someone reading a familiar book. Her eyes tracked muzzle flashes, calculated trajectories, identified the crew-served weapon on the northern ridge by its deeper bark and slower rate of fire. The 6th guard, the last one standing, made a desperate sprint for the narrow exit passage. He almost made it. The rounds caught him in the doorway, spinning him around in a grotesque pirouette before dumping him face down in the dust. Silence rushed back in, broken only by Massimo's ragged breathing and the metallic clicks of the Vespri soldiers reloading. Smoke drifted across the ruins, mixing with the dust kicked up by hundreds of rounds. The smell of cordite overwhelmed the sage and rosemary. Massimo had dropped to his knees behind a low section of wall that wouldn't stop a determined sneeze, let alone a rifle round. His hands pressed against the stone, fingers splayed, chest heaving. His eyes were unfocused, seeing nothing, drowning in the shock of betrayal and imminent death. Carmine Vesperi emerged from cover, a pistol held loosely at his side. His skeletal smile was genuine now, touched with the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. He nodded to his lieutenant, who raised a radio to his lips. "Finish it," Carmine said. The gunfire resumed, concentrated now, walking toward Massimo's inadequate cover with methodical precision. Sophia set down her silver tray with careful precision. She took off her white cotton gloves, folding them neatly beside the espresso cups. Then she moved. Sophia crossed the kill zone in 4 strides, her black dress billowing as rounds sparked off stone inches from her path. She hit Massimo like a linebacker, her shoulder driving into his ribs with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. They tumbled together behind the massive marble column she'd positioned herself near, the only piece of cover in the courtyard, thick enough to stop high-caliber rifle fire. Massimo gasped, his back pressed against ancient stone that was suddenly warm with absorbed sunlight and recent bullet impacts. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated with shock. He stared at Sophia as if she'd materialized from thin air, unable to reconcile the maid who'd poured his wine with the woman who'd just saved his life. What are you?" he stammered, then flinched as a burst of gunfire chewed into the opposite side of their cover, sending marble chips raining down on them. "Stay down," Sophia said. Her voice was calm, clinical, utterly devoid of the deference she'd carried for 3 years of service. She was already moving, low and fast, ignoring Massimo's sputtering protests. "Get back here! Hide, you stupid girl! You'll be—" But she was gone, crawling on her elbows toward Costa's body. The head of security lay 5 meters away in a spreading pool of his own blood, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. Sophia reached him in seconds, her white apron dragging through the red, absorbing it like a grotesque watercolor. She pressed 2 fingers against Costa's neck, a perfunctory gesture. No pulse. She'd known there wouldn't be. She'd seen the shot placement. but old habits died hard. Her hands moved to his jacket, efficiently checking pockets and finding nothing useful. His sidearm was still holstered, a 9mm that would be useless against targets 200 meters out. But cradled in his dead arms, still clutched against his chest in a final protective embrace, was the rifle. A custom Remington 700, chambered in .308, with a Schmidt and Bender scope that cost more than most cars. Costa had been carrying it to the meeting as a statement piece, a symbol of the firepower backing Massimo's negotiations. He'd never fired it in anger, had probably never zeroed it himself. It was jewelry, not a weapon. To Sophia, it was salvation. She pried it from Costa's grip, her movements quick and sure. Behind her, Massimo had found his voice again, screaming at her over the intermittent gunfire. "Sophia, get back here! What are you doing? You can't, you don't know how to—" She ignored him. Her hands moved over the rifle with the automatic precision of muscle memory, checking the chamber in a smooth 3-count. Bolt back, round visible. Bolt forward. The magazine was full, 5 rounds of match-grade ammunition that Costa had probably loaded himself to justify the expense. The scope's elevation was set for 100 meters, completely wrong for the targets on the ridge. A round cracked past her head, close enough that she felt the pressure wave. The Vespri shooters had spotted her movement. She had seconds before they adjusted their aim. While Sophia dropped prone behind a low section of collapsed wall, the rifle coming to her shoulder as naturally as breathing. Her white apron spread out behind her in the dust, a flag of surrender that meant the opposite. The lace trim caught on rough stone, tearing, but she didn't notice. Her cheek found the stock, her eye found the scope, and the world narrowed to a circle of magnified distance. Through the glass, she could see them. 3 shooters on the northern ridge, positioned behind scrub brush and limestone outcroppings. The one on the left was firing a semi-automatic, probably an AR platform rifle. Center was the crew-served weapon she'd identified earlier, a light machine gun with a bipod. Right side was another rifle, the shooter just visible through the vegetation. Her breathing slowed. Her heart rate dropped. The chaos and screaming and dying faded into background static as her body remembered what her mind had spent 3 years trying to forget. Behind her, Massimo had stopped shouting. He stared at his maid, at the way she'd melted into the firing position, at the absolute stillness of her body, except for the microscopic adjustments of her trigger finger. Sophia exhaled half a breath and squeezed. The rifle thundered, the recoil driving back into her shoulder with familiar violence. 230 meters away, the shooter on the left stopped firing. Before we continue, my abusive father said, "I won't hit 4,000 subscribers. He also said, I'm wasting my time uploading videos. I need you all to prove him wrong. Hit that subscribe button right now. Let's continue." The first target dropped without ceremony, tumbling backward into the scrub brush with the boneless collapse of a puppet released from its strings. Sophia was already working the bolt, the brass casing ejecting in a lazy arc that caught the sunlight before bouncing off stone. She didn't watch it fall. Her eye never left the scope. The wind had shifted. She could feel it on her exposed neck, coming from the west now, maybe 3 miles per hour. Not enough to matter at 100 meters, but at this range it would push the round 4 inches right. She adjusted, a tiny correction of the barrel, reading the landscape the way Massimo read balance sheets. The heat shimmer off the stones would create vertical distortion. The sun angle meant she was shooting slightly uphill into shadow, making range estimation treacherous. But Sophia had learned to calculate ballistics before she'd learned to calculate grocery bills. Her mind processed variables that most people couldn't name, compensating for bullet drop and atmospheric pressure with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. The machine gun crew was arguing. She could see the gunner gesturing at where his teammate had been, pointing at the distant courtyard, trying to locate the threat. He didn't understand yet. None of them did. They'd been told the targets would be helpless, caught in a kill box with nowhere to run. Nobody had mentioned return fire. Nobody had planned for competence. Sophia adjusted for the new windage, led the target by half a body width to account for his movement, and fired. The gunner's head snapped back, and the machine gun went silent. His partner dove for cover, scrambling behind the limestone outcropping in a panic that made him visible for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds was a lifetime. Sophia's third shot caught him in the shoulder as he rolled behind the rock, spinning him sideways. Not a kill shot, but it removed him from the fight. She worked the bolt again, brass singing against marble, and shifted to the eastern ridge. 2 shooters there, both with AR pattern rifles, both realizing too late that their concealment had been compromised. They were breaking position, trying to relocate, moving through the brush with the jerky desperation of men who'd suddenly discovered they were the prey instead of the hunters. The one on the left made it 6 steps before Sophia's 4th round found him. The one on the right had better instincts. He dropped flat immediately, or trying to present no target at all. But Sophia had already marked his position, and patience was something she'd learned to cultivate during 3 years of pouring coffee and absorbing insults. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Behind her, she could hear Massimo's ragged breathing, could sense him staring at her with an intensity that bordered on religious awakening. The Vesperi soldiers in the courtyard had stopped their advance, confused by the sudden silence from their overwatch positions. On the ridge, the prone shooter shifted his weight, just a fraction, just enough to check if the threat had passed. Sophia saw the movement, a disturbance in the brush pattern, a shadow that didn't match the terrain. She adjusted her aim 2 degrees left and fired her 5th and final round. The brush stopped moving. She rolled onto her side, ejecting the empty magazine and reaching for Costa's tactical vest. He'd carried 2 spare magazines, both loaded with the same match-grade ammunition. Her fingers found the first one, seated it with a practiced motion that made no wasted movement, and she was back in position before the brass had finished ringing against stone. The southern ridge still had shooters, but they were reconsidering their life choices. Sophia could see them through the scope. 3 men clustered behind an outcropping, having a heated discussion conducted entirely in violent gestures. One wanted to advance, one wanted to retreat. The third was on a radio, probably asking Carmine what the hell was happening. Sophia answered the question with a round that sparked off the rock 6 inches from the radio operator's head. The discussion ended. They retreated, scrambling down the reverse slope with the undignified haste of men who'd realized the odds had changed. In the courtyard, Carmine Vesperi had emerged from cover, his skeletal face twisted with an emotion somewhere between rage and disbelief. He was screaming at his lieutenant, at his remaining soldiers, at the hills that had suddenly gone quiet. His grand ambush had become a massacre, but not the one he'd planned. Massimo hadn't moved. He sat with his back against the column, his €1,000 suit destroyed, his hand still shaking, his eyes locked on Sophia. She could feel his stare even without looking at him, could sense the fundamental recalculation happening behind those eyes. His chief of security had never made a shot past 100 meters. Costa had been competent, professional, respected. The maid lying in the dust with her apron soaked in blood had just cleared an entire ridgeline in under 2 minutes. "Stay down, Don De Luca." The words came out sharp and clipped, carrying the kind of authority that Massimo hadn't heard directed at him since his father died. He opened his mouth to protest, to remind this woman of her place, to reassert the natural order of things. But Sophia had already dismissed him, her attention focused on the tactical problem unfolding around them. She'd cleared the ridges, but the courtyard itself was still contested ground. Carmine's men had taken cover among the ruins, at least 8 of them still combat effective, and they were beginning to coordinate. The lieutenant with the radio was directing movement, using hand signals to position his soldiers for a final push. They had numbers, and they had surprise. What they didn't have anymore was overwatch, and that made them nervous. Nervous men made mistakes, but they also made desperate decisions. Sophia scanned the battlefield through her scope, reading the tactical picture the way she'd once read dinner menus for Massimo's guests. The Vesperi soldiers were consolidating near the western exit, preparing to either assault or retreat. Either option would put them in her firing lane, and they knew it, which meant they were waiting for something. She found it on the southern approach. The sound reached her first, a mechanical rattle that was distinct from rifle fire, deeper and more sustained. Then she saw the movement, a vehicle grinding up the dirt track that led to the ruins. An old pickup truck, rust-colored and anonymous, with something mounted in the bed that made her stomach drop. A PKM machine gun, belt-fed, probably loaded with 200 rounds of 7.62, the kind of weapon that turned cover into concealment and concealment into memory. It was crewed by 2 men, the gunner already swinging the barrel toward the courtyard, the assistant feeding the belt. Sophia's rifle was precision, single shot, perfect for the ridges. Against a truck-mounted machine gun with that much sustained firepower, it was a scalpel facing a chainsaw. Merda, she whispered, the first Italian curse she'd allowed herself in 3 years. Behind her, Massimo had found enough composure to follow her gaze. When he saw the truck, the color drained from his face. "We need to run, now, while they're—" "Stay, not down." Sophia's voice carried the kind of finality usually reserved for last rites. "They have overlapping fields of fire on every exit. You run, you die. Simple mathematics." "Then what?" But she was already moving, low and fast, scrambling back toward the refreshment table where the dead guard had collapsed. The table itself was overturned, expensive bottles scattered across the marble. Most had shattered, but one had survived. A bottle of Macallan 25, the whiskey Massimo served to visiting dignitaries because it cost €800 and tasted like liquid smugness. Sophia grabbed it, along with a silk napkin that had somehow stayed pristine despite the carnage. The truck was grinding closer, maybe 60 meters out now, the machine gun's barrel tracking across the ruins like a predator selecting prey. She had seconds. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Napkin torn into strips, bottle uncapped, the whiskey splashing over her fingers. Strip of silk stuffed into the bottle's neck, soaking up the alcohol. The physics were simple. Glass container, flammable liquid, cloth wick, heat source. The Molotov cocktail predated the Mafia by decades, a weapon of revolution and desperation. Sophia had made her first one at 14. This was probably number 50. The problem was ignition. She had no lighter, no matches. Costa's body was too far away to search again, and the truck was 40 meters out now, the gunner already depressing the barrel toward their position. She could see his smile, the anticipation of overwhelming firepower about to solve all his problems. Then she saw the overturned brazier near the archway, or the one that had been providing ambient heat for the meeting. Coal still glowed orange beneath the ash. Sophia didn't hesitate. She sprinted across 10 meters of open ground while the machine gun tracked her movement, while Massimo screamed something incoherent behind her, while Carmine's men popped up from cover to take opportunistic shots. Rounds sparked off stone. One tugged at her dress, close enough to feel the heat. She reached the brazier, thrust the whiskey bottle's wick into the coals, and watched the silk catch with a satisfying whoosh of blue flame. The truck was 30 meters away when she stood, cocked her arm back, and hurled €800 of vintage scotch with every ounce of strength she possessed. The bottle traced a perfect arc through the afternoon sun, trailing fire like a comet. It shattered against the truck's hood in a bloom of orange flame that spread across the windshield and into the bed. The assistant feeder screamed, batting at his burning shirt. The gunner tried to traverse the weapon through the flames, but the heat drove him back, and the truck swerved hard right. It hit a section of collapsed wall at 15 miles per hour and stopped dead. The machine gun's barrel pointed uselessly at the sky. Sophia was already running back to cover, her torn apron streaming behind her, her face set in an expression of absolute focus. She dove behind the column as return fire chased her, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up with Costa's rifle already at her shoulder. Massimo stared at her, his mouth working soundlessly. Finally he managed. You just make me an espresso later," Sophia said, and fired into the burning truck. "We're not done yet." The burning truck provided exactly 90 seconds of distraction. Before the Vespri soldiers remembered, they outnumbered the opposition 8-1. Sophia used 87 of those seconds to disappear into the ruins, leaving Massimo pressed against the marble column with his mouth still hanging open and no idea where his maid had gone. She moved through the ancient architecture like smoke, her black dress absorbing the shadows cast by crumbling walls and fallen archways. The white apron that had once been her badge of servitude was now brown with dirt and rust red with other people's blood, paradoxically making her less visible against the sun-bleached stone. She'd torn away the lace trim that had caught on rubble, transforming the garment from decoration into camouflage, and the rifle she left behind. At close quarters, in confined spaces, where shots would be measured in meters instead of hundreds, the Remington was a liability. Instead, she'd taken Tony's sidearm from his corpse as she passed. A Beretta 92, 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not her first choice, but beggars and battlefield scavengers couldn't afford preferences. The ruins formed a maze of half-walls and toppled columns, the accumulated destruction of centuries creating a three-dimensional puzzle that favored the defender. Or in this case, the hunter. Sophia had spent the first 5 minutes of the ambush doing more than just surviving. She'd been mapping the terrain, cataloguing choke points, and sight lines with the same attention to detail she'd once used to memorize Massimo's dinner preferences. She knew where the Vespri soldiers would position themselves. She knew their fields of fire and their blind spots. She knew which sections of wall would stop bullets, and which were merely ancient Roman facade over hollow space. The machine gun nest from the truck had been abandoned after the fire, but 2 of Carmine's men had claimed it as a fallback position. They'd dragged the PKM clear of the flames and set it up behind a section of wall that provided excellent coverage of the courtyard's eastern approach. Smart positioning, professional. They'd forgotten to watch their backs. Sophia approached from the south, using a collapsed aqueduct as concealment, her footsteps silent on stone that had absorbed noise for 2 millennia. She could hear them talking, their voices carrying in the afternoon stillness between bursts of gunfire. The assistant feeder was complaining about his burned hands, his voice high and nervous. The gunner was telling him to shut up, to focus, to watch for movement from the column where they'd last seen targets. Neither of them was watching the shadowed gap in the wall 6 meters behind their position. Sophia emerged from the ruins the way she used to emerge from the kitchen, quietly, efficiently, already knowing exactly what needed to be done and in what order. The assistant feeder saw her first, his burned hands fumbling for the pistol at his belt. She shot him twice in the chest before the weapon cleared leather, the Beretta's report flat and businesslike in the enclosed space. The gunner spun, faster than his partner, his own sidearm already rising. He was good, ex-military by the speed of his draw, at probably Army Special Forces before Carmine had recruited him. Under different circumstances, he might have been fast enough. But Sophia had been doing this since before he'd finished basic training. She sidestepped his first shot, closed the distance before he could fire again, and put 3 round center mass in a tight grouping that any instructor would have praised. He dropped across the machine gun, his blood mixing with his partner's on the ancient stone. Sophia didn't pause to confirm the kills. Dead men didn't need confirmation, they just needed to be stepped over. She moved through the nest with the ruthless efficiency of someone cleaning a room, checking the weapon, clearing the ammunition belt from the feed tray, rendering the PKM useless. The whole process took 8 seconds. Then she was moving again, deflowing from shadow to shadow, her breathing steady and her heart rate barely elevated. This was the mathematics she understood better than any ledger Massimo kept. Angles and timing, violence reduced to its essential geometry. 2 more of Carmine's soldiers were holding a position near the western exit, using an overturned stone sarcophagus as cover. They were watching the courtyard, waiting for Massimo to make a break for freedom. They never saw Sophia approach from their flank, never heard her footsteps, never knew they were in danger until she was already firing. 4 rounds, 2 targets. Both dropped. She collected a fresh magazine from one of the bodies, performed a tactical reload without breaking stride, and continued her circuit of the ruins. The white apron streamed behind her like a banner, to no longer a symbol of submission, but a tally sheet of debts collected. Somewhere in the courtyard, Carmine was screaming orders that nobody could follow, because the men he was giving them to were already dead. Somewhere behind a marble column, Massimo was beginning to understand that the woman who'd served his coffee for 3 years had been rearranging furniture. She was just moving different pieces now. Carmine Vesperi had built his reputation on 2 principles: overwhelming force and strategic patience. When the first failed, he defaulted to the second, which meant sending in the specialist he'd been saving for exactly this kind of complication. The Butcher of Palermo didn't have a real name anymore, just a title earned over 15 years of wet work across 3 continents. He was a broad-shouldered nightmare in a canvas jacket, his hand scarred from a decade of close-quarters killing, his face memorable only in its complete averageness. He'd been waiting in the truck convoy as insurance, the expensive solution to expensive problems. Carmine pointed toward the marble column where Massimo was cowering. The butcher nodded once and began his approach, moving through the ruins with the patient methodology of someone who'd never failed to close a contract. Sophia saw him coming from her position near the western wall. She'd just cleared the last of Carmine's soldiers from the perimeter and was reloading the Beretta when movement caught her eye. A man advancing on Massimo's position with the kind of purposeful calm that separated professionals from enthusiasts. She raised the pistol, squeezed the trigger. The firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. She'd miscounted. What the magazine she'd scavenged had been partially spent, and she'd burned through the remaining rounds, clearing the nest. The Beretta was empty, and the butcher was 20 meters from Massimo, with nothing between them but rubble and failing light. Sophia dropped the useless pistol and ran. She closed the distance in seconds, her footsteps finally making noise as she abandoned stealth for speed. The butcher heard her coming and turned, his hand moving to the knife at his belt, with the unconscious reflex of someone who'd killed more people with steel than most men had met in their lifetime. Sophia hit him at full sprint, driving her shoulder into his midsection, trying to use momentum to compensate for his 80-pound weight advantage. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and rolling across stone that Roman craftsmen had fitted without mortar 2,000 years ago. The butcher recovered first. He was older, heavier, stronger, and had been fighting for his life since before Sophia learned to read. His knee came up, driving into her ribs with enough force to crack bone. She gasped, the air exploding from her lungs, and his hands found her throat. The pressure was immediate and absolute. His thumbs pressed into her windpipe with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much force was required, and for how long. Sophia's vision began to tunnel, red creeping in from the edges. She clawed at his wrists, but he'd been strangled before, knew all the counters, adjusted his grip to compensate. 10 seconds. That's how long she had before unconsciousness. 20 before irreversible brain damage. 30 before death. Her hands moved to her waist, fingers finding the apron strings that had somehow survived the battle. The white cotton was still knotted in a bow she'd tied that morning in a different lifetime, when her biggest concern was whether the Don preferred his espresso with 1 sugar or 2. She unknotted it with failing fingers, yanked one end free, and looped it around the butcher's neck in a single desperate motion. His grip loosened fractionally, not from choice, but from autonomic response as his brain registered the new threat. Sophia sucked in half a breath and pulled. The apron strings were industrial grade, designed to withstand years of commercial kitchen work, treated with starch that made them rigid as wire. She crossed them behind his neck and hauled back with everything she had left, using his own body weight as leverage. The butcher released her throat to grab at the ligature, his fingers scrambling for purchase on the cotton that was now crushing his carotid artery. He was stronger, but she had position and desperation and 3 years of suppressed violence demanding release. They rolled again, locked together in an embrace that looked almost intimate from a distance. His elbow caught her in the temple, sending stars across her vision. His fist hammered into her kidney, once, twice, professional strikes meant to disable. But Sophia had learned to fight in places where stopping meant dying, and she'd spent 3 years remembering every slight, every dismissive gesture, every time she'd been treated as furniture. She pulled tighter. The butcher's movements became frantic, then uncoordinated, then weak. His face turned purple, then grey, or the scarred hands that had killed across 3 continents scrabbled uselessly at the apron strings, finding no purchase, no salvation, no mercy. Sophia held on until his struggles stopped. Then she held on for another 30 seconds, because amateurs let go too early and professionals stayed dead. When she finally released the pressure, the butcher of Palermo collapsed face down on stone that had seen emperors and slaves, and now one more body. She stood over him, swaying, her ribs screaming and her throat raw, the white apron strings still clutched in her shaking hands. Massimo stared at her from his position behind the column, no longer cowering, but not quite ready to stand. Between them lay the corpse of the man who'd never failed a contract. Until he'd met the maid. The silence that followed the butcher's death was different from the silence that had preceded the ambush. That first quiet had been pregnant with violence, heavy with anticipation. This one was empty, hollow, the kind of stillness that settles over battlefields after the last shot has been fired and everyone is busy counting costs. Carmine Vesperi stood behind his section of wall, his skeletal frame rigid with the kind of rage that came from watching a perfect plan disintegrate. He'd brought 15 men to slaughter one. Now 8 of those men were corpses scattered across ancient ruins, killed by a woman in a maid's uniform who just strangled his best enforcer with her apron strings. The mathematics had shifted, and Carmine hadn't survived 40 years in the Cosa Nostra by ignoring mathematics. He signaled to his remaining soldiers, a sharp gesture that meant retreat, regroup, reassess. The 3 men still combat effective didn't need to be told twice. They'd watched the maid move through the ruins like something out of their grandmother's warnings, and none of them were being paid enough to die for a Don who'd clearly miscalculated. They fell back toward the vehicles, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who knew the difference between retreat and rout. Carmine went last, pausing at the edge of the ruins to stare across the courtyard at Massimo, still pressed against his marble column. His expression promised that this wasn't finished, that debts had been tallied and would be collected. Then he was gone, and the ruins belonged to the dead and the survivors, though the line between the two categories seemed uncomfortably thin. Sophia stood over the butcher's body, her chest heaving, her throat bearing the dark imprints of fingers that would bloom into bruises by nightfall. Blood streaked her face from a cut above her eyebrow she didn't remember receiving. Her black dress was torn at the shoulder, shredded at the hem, and stained with substances that would never come out no matter how much bleach she used. The white apron was almost unrecognizable, transformed from starched cotton to a brown and crimson flag of attrition. She reached up with shaking hands and adjusted her headpiece. The small white cap had somehow stayed attached through the entire battle, though it sat crooked now, knocked askew during her fight with the butcher. She straightened it with the same careful attention she'd used every morning for 3 years, fingers automatically smoothing the fabric even as blood dripped from her knuckles. The gesture was absurd, ridiculous. A woman standing in a charnel house, surrounded by corpses she'd created, adjusting her uniform as if preparing to serve afternoon tea. But the familiar motion helped, gave her hands something to do, while her mind processed what had just happened, what she'd just revealed, what she could never take back. In the distance, the sound of engines grew louder. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, the distinctive rumble of the armored SUVs that Massimo's organization favored. His reinforcements, finally arriving from Rome, 20 minutes too late to matter. They'd been delayed by a convenient traffic accident on the highway, a mechanical problem that had appeared at exactly the wrong time. Carmine's planning had been thorough. He'd just failed to account for one variable that hadn't appeared in any of his intelligence reports. The SUVs roared into the ruins in a cloud of dust, disgorging soldiers who fanned out with weapons raised, searching for threats that were either dead or departed. They moved through the courtyard with professional caution, clearing corners and checking bodies, their tactical discipline impressive and completely unnecessary. The ranking officer, a captain named Nero who'd served Massimo for 15 years, found his Don still pressed against the marble column. Massimo waved him off, his eyes never leaving Sophia. Nero followed his Don's gaze and stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. The maid stood in the center of the kill zone, her posture perfect despite her injuries, her hands clasped in front of her apron in the same position she'd held them 1,000 times while waiting for instructions. Around her lay the evidence of systematic carnage, bodies in precise locations, kill shots that spoke of training and practice, a tactical problem solved with the same efficiency she'd once used to organize dinner parties. Nero's men spread out, securing the perimeter, photographing evidence, beginning the grim mathematics of body count and bullet trajectory. They gave Sophia a wide berth, moving around her the way water flows around stone, none of them quite willing to get close to the woman in the blood-stained uniform. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, adjusting her headpiece and waiting, because after 3 years of service, waiting was what maids did. Except everyone in the ruins knew she wasn't a maid anymore, possibly had never been one. Massimo finally found the strength to stand, his legs shaking, his expensive suit destroyed beyond any tailor's ability to repair. He walked toward Sophia on unsteady feet, Nero moving to intercept and then thinking better of it. The Don of Rome stopped 3 feet from his maid, staring at her with an expression somewhere between terror and religious awe. "Who are you?" he whispered. Sophia met his eyes, her own gaze flat and professional, and straightened her headpiece one final time. "Someone who needs to discuss her employment terms, Don De Luca." The The mansion felt different when they returned. The same marble floors, the same Renaissance paintings worth more than small countries, or the same Baroque excess that announced wealth in every gilded surface and crystal chandelier. But the weight in the air had changed, transformed from the comfortable hierarchy of master and servant into something undefined and dangerous. Massimo sat in his study nursing a glass of whiskey that kept getting refilled by shaking hands. His other captains had been dismissed, sent away with vague instructions to secure the perimeter and say nothing to anyone. Nero lingered near the door, uncertain of his role in whatever was about to happen. The Don hadn't spoken during the drive back from the ruins, had barely acknowledged the concerned questions from his men, had simply stared out the window at the passing countryside with the expression of someone whose reality had been fundamentally rewritten. Sophia had ridden in the second vehicle, wedged between two soldiers who couldn't decide if they should guard her or ask for her autograph. She'd spent the trip in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her torn uniform a testament to violence that none of them could quite process. The woman who'd served them breakfast that morning had killed more men in 20 minutes than most of them had in their entire careers. Now she stood in the mansion's entrance hall, still wearing the ruined dress and blood-stained apron, waiting. Old habits were hard to break, even after everything. Especially after everything. Massimo emerged from his study after an hour, the whiskey apparently having restored some of his composure, if not his confidence. He walked toward Sophia with the careful steps of someone approaching a dangerous animal, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like caution. "The guest room's on the 3rd floor," he said, his voice not quite steady. You should clean yourself up. Rest. We'll discuss." He gestured vaguely, unable to find words for what needed discussing. "Tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow." Sophia didn't move. "And after you've rested," Massimo continued, finding his footing in familiar territory, the comfortable space of giving orders. "The study needs attention. Some of the books were disturbed when we left. The silver in the dining room should be polished for—" "No." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Massimo stopped mid-sentence, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "What did you say?" "I said no, Massimo." His name without the title, flat and final. "But I'm not cleaning your study. I'm not polishing your silver. I'm done taking orders." The silence stretched. Nero's hand drifted toward his weapon, then stopped when Massimo raised a hand. The Don's face had gone very still, the way it did when he was calculating odds and consequences. "You work for me," he said carefully. "You've worked for me for 3 years. Whatever happened today doesn't change. Everything changed today." Sophia began walking, not away but forward, deeper into the mansion. Her footsteps echoed on marble floors she'd mopped 100 times, past furniture she'd dusted, through rooms she'd cleaned. But she wasn't moving like a maid anymore. She was moving like someone who knew exactly where she was going and what she intended to do when she got there. The dining room was vast, designed to host gatherings of 40 or more, dominated by a table of ancient oak that had supposedly belonged to a Medici prince. Massimo sat at its head for important meetings, the position of power that announced his status before he spoke a word. Sophia walked past his chair without pausing and continued to the far end of the table. She pulled out the seat that faced his across 30 feet of polished wood, the position reserved for equals or honored guests, and sat down. The torn apron spread across the expensive upholstery. Blood flaked onto wood that cost more per inch than most people earned in a month. She folded her hands on the table, her posture perfect, and waited. Massimo stood in the doorway, frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Behind him, Nero had gone very pale, though whether from shock at the disrespect or fear of what it implied was unclear. "Sit down, Massimo," Sophia said. Not a request. Not quite an order. Something in between that suggested the old rules no longer applied and new ones were being written in real time. He sat. Not in his chair, but in the one nearest to her end of the table, the gesture of someone who'd recognized that geography had shifted. "I don't serve coffee anymore," Sophia said, her voice carrying down the length of the room with perfect clarity. "I think we need to discuss my raise, and my new title, and what happens to the people who tried to kill you today." She smiled then, a small expression that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that Massimo had seen in mirrors but never directed at him. "Consider this a performance review, Don De Luca. Let's talk about my future with the family." Outside, the sun was setting over Rome, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. Inside the mansion, the old order had died in ancient ruins, and something new was being negotiated at a table where servants were never supposed to sit. The espresso machine in the kitchen sat silent and cold. It would stay that way. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like and subscribe button. See you in the next one.